Hey guys, I'm Archie, and after a long wait, I welcome you to the third episode of the YYToolkit module development series. Now, if you recall what we did previously, we created a very basic mod that, while it doesn't touch the game in any meaningful way, it does load into it just fine, and after it does so, it prints a warning saying that the mod initialized successfully. Now, while that's all good, the plugin isn't actually running in the context of the engine, and therefore doing stuff like accessing engine state or calling engine functions may not always be safe to do. It's essentially a race condition depending on what the engine is currently doing. Now, to alleviate potential race conditions, YYToolkit provides a system of callbacks that allows you to run your code in the context of an engine thread. Now, to start using callbacks, you're going to want to call the create_callback function in the YYToolkit interface. As you can see, it takes a couple of parameters. This is documented on the wiki, so if you're not sure what to provide, you can just head up there and see for yourself what the parameters are. They might change in the future, so I'm not gonna speak about them in great detail here, so to not make this video instantly outdated the moment I decide to change the function definition. But as it stands now, the first parameter is the RE module that we're currently in, so I'm just gonna pass in module. It's also possible to pass in the AR self module global that RE provides. It's the exact same thing as the module being passed into module initialize or module pre-initialize. It's just a shorthand, so you don't have to pass this pointer around or store it in another global. Now, next up, we need to provide a trigger for our callback. What this does is it basically decides when our callback actually gets invoked. So to do that, we're just gonna type YYTK to go into the namespace, and then we're gonna select the frame callback. So it's gonna be event frame. Now, the prototype of this function is different depending on which event trigger you actually chose, but mostly it follows the same kind of pattern. It's always a function that returns void, and we can name it anything. I'm just gonna name it my callback. And it takes in a fw something. Now, this fw something is a function wrapper, and what this something is dependent on which event trigger you actually chose. Now, I chose an event frame trigger, so I'm gonna be taking an fw frame reference such that the internal state is changeable, and I'm just gonna name the parameter context. I'm gonna go and create the function body, and that's essentially the callback set up and ready to go. Now, when we're done creating the callback, we can actually go back to this create callback call and pass in the function pointer to my callback just by typing its name like this. And last but not least, we can set the priority of this callback. Now, I recommend plugins just set this to 0 unless you are actually facing problems with some other plugins. Then maybe you can solve this by setting this number higher or lower, depending on what the problem is. After we've done that, we can just put a semicolon after it, and that's the callback essentially set up and ready to go. Now, once we're done registering the callback using the create callback function, we can actually come up back here and start writing code inside of the callback, which will get executed by the engine whenever a frame is rendered. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be calling a function called showDebugOverlay, which essentially just goes ahead and shows you all the frame times and logs that the GameMaker engine is producing while the game is running. As you can see, it has an official documentation page which we're going to base our code off of. Now, since this isn't an actual C++ function that we can just call by, say, doing showDebugOverlay or something like that, as you can see there's no such function, we're actually gonna need YYToolkit's interface accessible here in this callback function. Now, how do we do that? It's a local variable here. We can actually do that very simply by just taking it and moving it up to the global scope. I'm gonna make it static, and I'm gonna call it something else, such as G for global YYTK interface. Now remember to rename everything that uses it. And now we're actually ready to use it in this callback function. But before we do that, since I'm already getting sick of typing out this YYTK namespace prefix, I'm actually going to go ahead and say using namespace YYTK, which just means I can now remove this YYTK namespace stuff that I've been using this whole time and essentially use it as if there was no namespace at all. While I'm at it, I'm also going to remove the warning about the unreferenced parameter for module here, since we actually use it now. I'm still going to keep the module path as an unreferenced parameter because it's not used anywhere else in the function. And now we're actually ready to start writing our callback code. Now, the first thing I'm going to do in the callback function is I'm going to check if the insert key was pressed by the user. I can do that just by typing if getAsync key state, which is a Windows API function. And for the parameter, I'm going to supply vkinsert. Now, I'm going to end this parameter with 1. To see why, you can go visit the Microsoft documentation. But essentially, getAsync key state returns a bit flag, and I'm just checking if the key was actually pressed instead of if it's being held. Now, if the user actually pressed the insert key, we're gonna want to toggle the state of the debug overlay. To do that, we need to have a flag that dictates whether it is currently on or off. To do this, we can either add another global variable or just make it a static variable inside of the myCallback function. I'm gonna go with the latter. So up here, I can just define a static boolean as overlay open. And by default, I'm just gonna set it to false. Now inside of the if statement, I can just set is overlay open to the opposite of whatever it currently is, essentially toggling it on and off. Another thing which I'm gonna do in the if statement is actually call the showDebugOverlay function. We don't have to call it all the time outside of the if statement because it only needs to be called once when the state itself changes. To call the function, I'm gonna use the GYYTK interface global and the call built-in method inside of it. Now, as you can see, this function takes 2 arguments. The first one is just the function name, which in my case is going to be the showDebugOverlay function. And the second one is a vector, i.e. an array of arguments that the function expects. Looking at the GameMaker documentation, there's only one non-optional argument, that being the enable flag. In this case, it's possible to just pass in the isOverlayOpen flag, which will work as the enable argument for the showDebugOverlay function. I can pass a temporary vector by just wrapping it inside of these parentheses. Once that's done, we essentially have the plugin ready to go. So I'm gonna go up to build solution, and I'm gonna install the plugin into the game. Installing a mod can either be done through the ORI manager or manually. I'm gonna go with the latter option as it's quicker for me to demonstrate in the tutorial. So first up, I'm gonna need to go into my build directory, which is provided in the Visual Studio build log, copy the DLL file, and then go into my target games directory, mods, and ORI. This is where all the mods for ORI are placed. you can see YYToolkit here and Quiet Launch, which is a plugin I use for quietening down GameMaker during the initialization stage. Next to these, I can simply place my file that I built and run the game like normal through the exe file. Running the game, we already see in the log that the mod initialized successfully, along with some other information about the game that YYToolkit has been able to figure out. Pressing insert now shows the debug overlay popping up like normal, and that's essentially all the mod does for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.